ain't going back. Not gonna buy into all that. Hey, hey, ain't gonna hide. Gonna let all the fears slide. Got Mother Nature is on my side. Got all of the loving growing.
All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome again to the New Now. I'm delighted to have a first-time guest on with us. Not first time for me. I've watched tons of what Jerry Marzinsky has done. 40 years of experience as a licensed psychotherapist. He's worked in some of the craziest, according to him, psychotic institutions, I guess you could say prisons in the U.S., working with dangerous criminals or so-called criminals, schizophrenics, as they're called, and volatile personalities. Jerry, welcome to the show. I'm delighted to be here with you.
Glad to be with you.
So we're going to call this one Mind Monsters. We're going to discuss those inside voices, the ones between the ears that Jerry and I have both concluded are real, not from you and maybe originating from somewhere else. Jerry, what would you say about that?
Well, shoot. I'm not quite sure where to start. My journey started at a place called Central State Hospital after graduate school. It was the biggest psychiatric institution in the United States at the time. I think there were about 10,000 patients there when I first arrived. And I got out of there, kind of going to cure the world out of graduate school. I'm going to, interested in abnormal psychology. And for somebody who was interested in abnormal psychology, it was a candy store of mental illness. And it was just, they had everything there. Nothing in college or graduate school prepared me for what I was going to encounter there. I mean, nothing. And after starting there, it seemed that I was working for a psychiatric rehabilitation center, they called the Yarborough Rehabilitation Center. And there were the goal of Yarborough vocational rehabilitation was to get the highest functioning, patients in that giant hospital. I mean, this thing sprawled over, I think it was 300 acres.
Whoa.
There were 200 buildings there. It was like a small city, and it was in the middle. It was the middle of nowhere. They didn't even have a McDonald's there when I was working. You had to drive 30 miles to Macon to get a hamburger. So, they had their own staff dorms. And, when I started there, I had never met a schizophrenic or anybody that was seriously mentally ill.
So it was kind of a prison. It was a prison, like I guess.
No, it was a giant psychiatric hospital.
Were voluntary or involuntary patients, so to speak?
Well, mostly involuntary.
Okay.
Yeah, it was a state hospital. They were not wanting to be there.
Mm.
And, I went there with the brainwashing that I got from the ivory tower, just like everybody else there. Schizophrenia was due to a chemical brain imbalance in the brain of these people. And, the only treatment were their high-powered psychiatric drugs. And I believe that like everybody else did. And then I began noticing some strange things that just didn't fit that scenario. Let me see what one of the first was the number of hospital psychiatrists that were getting beat up by schizophrenics. Nobody got pounded on more than the psychiatrists. I mean, not psych nurses, not dentists, not doctors, not counselors. The assault rate for psychiatrists was about equal to that of the hospital attendants that were on the wards there. So I'm like, they were only seeing psychotic patients for maybe 20 minutes a month, and I'm thinking, like, what are they doing to these people where they're getting the crap kicked out of them in 20 minutes? And what are you going to do to piss somebody off bad enough to get assaulted in 20 minutes? Had no idea. It was just an oddity. I mean, I stored it in there, and then one day I was doing rounds on the second floor of one of the big psychiatric units, and I saw a guy, kind of rambling around the ward, and he was carrying on a conversation with somebody I couldn't see. Mm. And I'm like, well, that's interesting, because I'd been taught in graduate school, oh yeah, the schizophrenics hear auditory and visual hallucinations. So when they tacked on the word hallucinations, I thought, hallucinations are random. It's just garbage. There's nothing coherent about it, was the idea I had in my mind when I heard that. And I didn't even know what the voices were, because they didn't talk about them. It wasn't in any of the psychology texts. It wasn't in any of the counseling courses. They referred to them as auditory hallucinations and didn't go into any detail. So I didn't know what they were. So I kind of crept over toward this guy and was trying to listen in on what he was saying. And it was like listening to one end of a telephone conversation where you could just hear the guy talking, but you couldn't hear who was coming over the other line. And, he was carrying on a vehement argument with somebody that I couldn't see. And he had no telephone. And there were gaps there, like when you stop and you're talking to somebody and you stop to let them talk. Well, he was doing that. He'd rant and rave, and he was screaming at and arguing with whatever or whoever he was arguing with. And then he'd stop and he'd listen, and then he'd respond to whatever they said.
Do you remember what he was arguing about?
Well, I wanted to find out, so I crept a little closer.
Right.
So I was going, well, maybe I can listen in on what he's saying, so I have some idea. So I kind of shuffled over there kind of innocuously and snuck up a little bit behind him. You don't want to get too close to us. I kind of faced him from behind. And I was trying to hear what he said. And then he turns around and he sees me. And I said, okay, the jig's up. And, I said, I hadn't seen you here before. Are you new to this unit? And he goes, yeah, I just got here the other day. And I said, what's your name? And he looks me right in the eye and he goes, Jesus Christ. He says, I'm Jesus Christ. And, my memory shot back to undergraduate school instantly, to this one paper that they made us read for abnormal psychology. And it was written by a clinical psychologist. And the gist of the paper was that if two lunatics met each other with the same delusion, one of them would have to change their delusion. And even as an undergraduate, I'm going, why would that have to happen? What sense does that make? I mean, and what I hated about psychology is that you couldn't check out anything that they were saying. Except in experimental psychology, you could go into the lab and you could see for yourself that what they were telling you was going to happen was actually happening in front of your face. But everything else, it was like, oh yeah, we just expect you to believe this at face value and don't question us. That didn't wash well with me. I had an innate distrust for authority, and it was like, okay, well, I'll memorize this stuff and I'll regurgitate it, but I don't know whether I should trust it or not. So my memory shot back to that paper where that here's this clinical psychologist saying, one of the crazy guys has to change his delusion. And I just, even at that time, I found that really odd. I said, that just doesn't wash. And I tucked it back in the back of my head, thinking maybe one day I'll get a chance to check it out.
Right.
So I looked this guy straight in the eye and I said, you can't be Jesus Christ, because I am. And I stepped back and I'm like, okay, what's he going to do? Let's see if what this guy wrote is true. And the guy kind of froze and he looked at me. He was kind of taken back a little bit. He started thinking about it. And then he goes, okay, we can go both be Jesus Christ. And he struts off. And I go, well, Yeah, they screwed me on that one. What else did they lie to me about? You know, so it was like, okay, you know, there's one. You know, there's
Right,
one.
right.
So strike one. So um, yeah, it took me back to this when he was arguing with whoever or whatever he was arguing with. It was in complete sentences with complete thoughts. It wasn't like you know, verbal salad. It wasn't, you know, it was completely comprehensible. It was, you know, they were full sentences, full ideas. It wasn't just babble. And that kind of got my attention because I was thinking from what they had in the text, auditory hallucinations, well, they're just going to be all over the place. So I kind of watched out for that. And, you know, with time, I saw other patients doing the same thing, you know. And you know, I started asking them some questions about the voices. They were really uncomfortable answering them because they didn't trust psychology. You know, we were basically hired spies for psychiatry to keep an eye on the prison, on the in the population, the psychiatric population. If any of them were getting out of control, if we couldn't control it, we'd bring in the big guns with psychiatry, and they'd come in with the major tranquilizers and knock these guys out. So they weren't comfortable talking about their voices because when psychiatry found out about them, if they were causing them problems or upsetting them, they just drug them. They drug them more.
Well, what sort of questions did you ask them?
Well, basically, what are they saying? Now, one thing that was really odd is we'd all been taught that they were hallucinations, you know, but nobody I saw at that giant hospital was the least bit curious about what they were saying. What were these voices telling these people? You know, so you know, I started edging in there to try to find out. Let me see what the next thing was.
Did any of them answer you straight?
Well, I got bits and pieces. Yeah, you know, it would be like one bit at a time. And then what I'd do is take that bit with the next guy I talked to, and I'd say, well, what are the voices telling you? I know this much, you know, and that helped a lot, you know, providing a few pieces that no other staff had. And it showed them that I was serious and I was really curious about what they were hearing, and I wasn't playing games with them. So they slowly started opening up. The more information I got about the voices, the more they opened up, until by the time you know, they had 7 years at that hospital, and I went to work in a large state prison in Arizona after that. I knew somewhat about the voices by the time I left there. But when psychiatry found out that I was asking the patients questions about their voices, I got called up on the carpet and told, the voices are hallucinations. You're making them worse by reinforcing them by asking these guys questions about it. Now stop it. You know, they ordered me to stop it. But by then I'd seen a little bit too much. Let me see, what was the next odd thing I saw, if I can remember it, was when the chaplain was holding an ice cream social in the psychiatric rehab center. All the other patients went down there for cake and ice cream because it was hard to come by at the state hospital, you know. So he would do his service, and then they'd have cake and ice cream and have a social hour, music and dancing or whatever. None of the schizophrenics went down there. So I noticed that once, and then it happened again, and there they all were again. None of them would go down there. The third time I started asking them questions. Why are you staying on this dingy ward? Why aren't you down there with the cake and ice cream crowd? And they go, well, we don't like preachers. There is no God. I don't want to go to church. I don't want anything to do with that. Totally anti-religious. They wanted nothing to do with church or anything else. And I said, well, that's odd. And I got to talking to some of them about if they ever went to church, and ask them, what effect did that have on the voices? And it proved interesting. It broke down into 3 categories. It was like if the voices were weak, and see, back then I wasn't sure what the voices were. I was still thinking it was some part of their subconscious mind. I mean, but it was a curious phenomena. So I found that if the voices were weak, when they went into the church, the voices would shut up. If they were of moderate strength, they would just keep babbling. They'd start mocking the preacher, saying he's a jerk, he's a fool, don't listen to what he has to say. So they would distract the person so he couldn't listen to what the preacher had to say. And the strongest ones would actually drive them out of the church. They'd just get up and they would run out of the church. So the first time I heard that, I started asking all the patients on my caseload. I said, what happened when you try to go to church? And it was the same pattern. Then the next thing, one of them said that when he recited the 23rd Psalm, his voices reacted like worms thrown on a hot frying pan. And I'm like, what kind of a hallucination does these kind of things?
What's the gist of the 23rd Psalm?
It's the one that said, the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. That one. They hate it, and then I checked that out. So if I got one bit of information from one schizophrenic patient and it seemed odd, I'd start asking all the others. There was no shortage of them. I had a bunch of them. I had as many as I wanted to talk to. I mean, they were all over the place. The only place where it was more convenient was when I got to the prison. They had turned the prisons into the state hospitals at that point. They shut down all the state hospitals, and all the psychiatric patients that couldn't function ended up in the prison because they had to rob stuff in order to survive. So it was very clear that whatever these things were, they were anti-religious. And it's like, well, what kind of hallucination? I mean, why would a hallucination care? So that wasn't jiving. And then, I'd ask around, like, what, why aren't they taking their medication? So what they would do, that virtually all of them, they'd put them on these antipsychotic drugs, which were awful. They're toxic, awful side effects. And virtually all of them would eventually go off, and then they go psychotic again. They completely lose it with time. Usually after 2 weeks of being off those things, the voices would come back. The medicines never really got rid of them. They weakened them. And they kind of tranquilized the patient, so he wasn't as volatile or acting out as much. And I got to wondering, time after time after time, almost all of them eventually went off those meds. And they knew that if they went off those meds, they would go psychotic. They would lapse back into that horrible world where it is. So I started asking them, well, why are you doing that? Oh, it's the side effects. I said, the side effects, huh? So what I got out was the DSM, and I wrote down all the symptoms of paranoid schizophrenia. They're awful. Seeing monsters, hearing voices telling you to kill yourself, seeing shadows in the room, feeling like people are following you. They're going to kill. I mean, it's just awful. It's like a nightmare. And I wrote down all those symptoms, And then I handed them first I handed them a blank sheet of paper, and I said, okay, write down all the side effects you had from your medicines. And they all didn't have the same side effects. So got the paper with the side effects. And then I gave them all the symptoms of paranoid schizophrenia. And I said, here, check all the ones that you've experienced when you were in a psychotic state. And it was bam, 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 bam. And then I gave them both back to him, and I said, what's worse? Are the side effects of the medicines worse, or is it worse to be floridly psychotic? Every single one of them said it was worse to be psychotic. There were no dissenters. And after, I was asking time after time, every single one of them that went off their medications, I would ask, why did you do that? Oh, side effects. Well, you knew what would happen if you went off your meds, right? Well, yeah. Then why'd you do it? Side effects. So I'd give them the 2 sheets of paper. Which is worse? Side effects. The side effects were not as bad as the actual condition. And then I'd ask them, well, then why'd you go off your meds if the schizophrenia is worse than the side effects? What'd you think they said? Every single one of them said, I don't know.
Really?
Really. Every single one. That went on for 3 years. I felt like one of them asking the same question over and over and over again and expecting a different answer.
Mm.
It took me 7 years to get the answer to that one.
Which was?
Well, what happened one day is, the only thing we had at that time, this is back in the mid 70s,
right,
that would control psychosis were the major tranquilizers. That was all they had. Talking to these people or counseling them was like water running off a duck's back. It had no effect whatsoever, none. So one day, what we did is after 3 strikes, after they went off their medications 3 times, we went, well, okay, if they're not going to stay on their meds, they're not going to be able to function out in public. So we'll discharge that one and we'll put somebody else in who looks like they have a better chance. They'll stay on their medications and they'll be able to function when we release them. So this girl had gone off for the 3rd time. She was, raised a big stink in the cosmetology class she was in. And we had to pull her out of there, put her back on her meds, and notified her mother that she was being discharged because she wasn't being compliant with treatment.
Discharged from the treatment, but still in prison, or is that what you mean?
She would still be in the hospital somewhere, but she wouldn't be in the rehab center.
Okay.
They might even send her back to her mother, but she wouldn't be there anymore.
Okay.
So the mother calls me and she's desperate. She said, don't do this. Don't do this. I can't deal with her when she's that way. I've tried. I'm going to come up there. We'll talk to her and see why. Well, let me talk to her. Let me drive up there. And she was down in South Georgia. So it was like several hour drive for her to get there. So I said, okay, all right, come on up this Friday and we'll talk to her. So the mother came in. We were both sitting in my office talking. We brought the gal in and, started talking to her. So, well, why'd you do this? And her mother's begging her, why'd you do it? Why do you keep going off your meds? You're about ready to get thrown out of the program. And she goes something like, well, you won't believe me even if I told you. And I said something like, hey, try me. I've heard some pretty strange stuff while I'm here. I don't think you're going to, frighten me off. So she said, okay. The voices told me that the psychiatrist was poisoning me with those meds. And they pointed out the side effects and said, this is the result of being poisoned. Mm. And right away, it was like, click. That's why all those the psychotics were beating up on the psychiatrist. Mm. The voices were telling them that they were being poisoned, and these guys were hitting back at them. So that was near the end of 7 years.
Well, I'm curious, weren't they kind of being poisoned by the medicines?
Yeah, they were being poisoned.
Yeah.
So those medicines are toxic. They're some of the most dangerous drugs in use today in medicine. They actually shrink the patient's brain with extended use. I mean, like a walnut, just shrink it to destroy the peripheral nervous system. And the hospital was full of patients that had been on those medications for years, and they no longer could walk normally. They called it the Thorazine shuffle, where they just kind of dragged their feet as they shuffled along. There was permanent damage to their nervous system and their brain.
So the voices were kind of right, I guess. It's
interesting. Yeah, they were virtually being poisoned slowly. And when that came out, some researchers, they found that when they were autopsying the bodies of chronic schizophrenics, they would find that their brains were all shrunk, abnormally shrunk, like rotten walnuts. And they published this paper, and the psychiatric mafia and big pharma went nuts. He went, oh no, it's due to the schizophrenia. That's what the schizophrenia shrunk their brain. And the researchers are going, well, wait a second, these guys have been on these neuroleptic drugs for years. We don't know. So they started feeding antipsychotic drugs, these neuroleptics, to monkeys and rats, and found out that with time their brain shrunk also. So they could no longer say, hey, these drugs weren't dangerous, but they went off like a firecracker going, oh, this ain't true, it's not, it's everything except that. And then they tried to hide it. They tried to hide it. You won't see it on any of the side effects and the medications listed, although it's a well-known symptom. And nor would they tell the patients that this was happening to them.
Where did this leave the patients, though? It seems between a rock and a hard place, so to speak. They have the voices, and the voices are kind of right about the medicine, or even exactly right. The medicine's poisoning them, and the doctor's poisoning them, but they still have the voices that are telling them what the voices are telling them. Where did that leave some of the more serious patients?
Well, the reason that the psychiatric mafia liked these medicines so well, because they were dumbing down the entire inmate population. They were just dumbing down the entire population, because maybe a decade or so before I got there, the only control they had over violent psychiatric patients was to get a bunch of attendants together and gang up on one of these violent patients, and try to give him a shot and then wrap him in a straitjacket.
Right.
And I heard stories of these major battles where attendants and patients were getting hurt.
Right.
When they were trying to stuff them into these straitjackets. So this was a miracle drug as far as the psychiatric mafia was concerned. They can control massive populations with less staff and less money with these drugs. So they charged a fortune for them, and they did their same old stuff. Oh yeah, we invested millions and millions of dollars in the development of these drugs. Now, another lie. Those drugs were found by accident in I think it was a dye lab in France, that were dyeing clothes. And they found that the people who were working in that dye lab would kind of get gorky and anesthetized a little bit. So they extracted that, and they were using it for a medicine for surgery, like a painkiller, like, alcohol or something like that would help with the surgery. And then some guy tried it on some psychiatric patients, and it calmed them right down. So they wouldn't let them try it in Europe because the Freudians were in control at that point, and they didn't want any of this pharmaceutical stuff. Everything was due to the ego, the id, and all that kind of stuff, so that they didn't want any part of it. So these guys went over to the United States, and they started administering it to hospital populations over here, and it worked marvelously. I mean, here's the entire population just calmed down and sitting in the corner, staring off into space and behaving themselves. They couldn't ask for more, So it became real popular in the United States. So the drug companies started producing it, by the barrelful, and it just spread like wildfire. So they were able to control these massive populations with these major tranquilizer drugs.
Sure.
At that point, they didn't know what damage it did to them, the patient at all. But for them, it was a miracle drug. So that was 7 years. For 7 years, I had no idea that the voices were behind that stuff. So I was back picking scraps. Let me see, what was the next thing that didn't make any sense. We'd all been taught in graduate school that schizophrenia is due to a chemical brain imbalance in the brains of these people. And then I noticed something really odd. I would sit in on these interviews with psychiatrists, with the patients, and never did I ever see a psychiatrist give any kind of lab work at all to determine which chemicals in the brain of the psychotic were out of order or were out of balance, by how much or by how much. Never. And I'm like, okay, well, if their brain chemicals are out of balance, how do they know which ones? I mean, there's like, a couple dozen of them in there. Which ones are out of balance by how much? So I started asking psychiatrists, I mean, how do you know what you're doing? And they go, oh, the drug companies figured it out already. They've got it all figured out. And I'm like, what? I'm like, that's like turning the fox loose in the hen house. Well, so here's this chemical imbalance thing with no measurement as to what's unbalanced and what's not. It was a total fraud. I found out later that not only did they have no evidence for a chemical imbalance, which is hitting the news these days really hard. I mean, it's been out there for years, but now it's hitting the public that there is no chemical brain imbalance, that they can find. It just doesn't exist. And the psychiatric mafia is screaming bloody murder, and the drug companies are screaming bloody murder, but they can't prove it. They can't prove any chemical brain imbalance. So that they went on that for decades. It came out by one of the drug companies that were selling an antidepressant back in the 70s. It's like, oh yeah, this is the chemical brain imbalance, and you take these meds and it'll straighten you out for da-da-da. None of these drugs cured anything. They cured absolutely nothing. As soon as you go off them, you're back to where you were. So you had that kind of fraud going on.
So where did that leave the patients, like throughout this journey as you were watching them and hearing what was going on with them and understanding that the drugs were doing or not doing what they were supposed to do?
Well, that's all we had back then was the drugs. Like I said, there was nothing else that would bring these people under control. And at that time, I didn't know how much damage it was doing to them. I didn't find that out until probably close to the time I retired, because of the big hullabaloo the psychiatric mafia threw up to kind of try to bury that, So there was one other time where I got in trouble at the state hospital for asking schizophrenics about their voices. So it was clear that the psychiatric mafia didn't want anybody kind of digging into that area at all, and they would have taken action to stop it. I don't know, they all believed that the voices were hallucinations. The whole hospital believed that the voices were hallucinations. And here I am curious about it. So I'm kind of asking questions about the voice. Nobody else was even curious. They weren't the least bit curious about what those voices were saying. The psychiatrist kept insisting that they were hallucinations until they found a patient that told them that the voices are telling them to kill themselves. Then all of a sudden they didn't become hallucinations anymore. They magically transformed and were a threat. They would lock those people down. They'd strip the cell. They'd put them on suicide watch, give them a suicide blanket, and fill them full of drugs and leave them there until they were no longer suicidal. Or they said they were no longer suicidal. So they were hallucinations until they found that the voices were telling the patient to kill themselves, and then they became very real for them. So I'm like, well, how does that wash out? That they're not real until this happens, and then all of a sudden they're real. And then they're jumping around like somebody's poked them in the butt with a hot rod. And it's like, what's going on with that? You know? So some of the other things they were doing were these prefrontal lobotomies. They were doing 3,000 a year there, where they get an ice pick. This was their gold standard for a while with people that were, usually somewhat uncontrollable. They get an ice pick and stick it through their eye socket and scramble their prefrontal cortex.
Nice.
And turn them into zombies. They were just passive zombies. Yeah.
So, when did you, flip your switch, so to speak, that besides, figuring out that the chemicals were making them more crazy or more docile?
So I didn't know that at the time.
Right.
I knew what they were doing. I knew it calmed them down. It made them manageable. A lot of them were returned to sanity. So you could talk to them. They were back to being oriented. But they were kind of, drugged up and lethargic, and the side effects, the dry mouth and the jerking movements and the sexual dysfunction and this horrific lineup of side effects that they hated, absolutely hated. But there was nothing else back then. We had nothing else back then. And even up to that point, even up to the 7th year, after what I knew by the time I left the hospital to go into a PhD program, I still wasn't sure what the voices were. I'm still thinking, well, is this some part of their subconscious? Is this, I just, and they were so frustrating. The schizophrenic, I just couldn't figure them out. They were driving me crazy. They were doing all this crazy. They would get right to the point where they were about to graduate from one of their training classes, and then they'd sabotage themselves. They were very self-destructive that way. On the backwards, their suicide rate was 3 to 5 times that of the general population. So they killed themselves at a very high rate. I was to find out later that the suicide rate of psychiatrists is virtually the same. So if you're looking at the stability of a population based on their suicide rate, psychiatrists are right up there with schizophrenics. So they were closing down the state hospital. Proposition 13 had swung through. They were closing down state hospitals all over the United States. And I'm going, this is a major mistake. They won't take their meds even when they're handed to them. They put them under their cheek, they cheek them, put them between their cheek and their teeth. And then when the staff isn't looking, they go spit them out. I remember one day where I was walking through one of the wards on the bottom floor of the unit I was working. And here were some maintenance men that were cutting off the bottom end of a pipe banister that ran up to the 2nd floor. And I knew that the cap on that banister on the 2nd floor was missing. So there was just a hole in the pipe. And, here were sparks flying all over the floor, and it was like a great show to watch that. And so all these patients gathered around there watching the sparks flying all over the place. And I'm there with them watching all the sparks flying all over the place. It was like a little fireworks show, with all this smoke, and they're cutting off the thing. I'm kind of wondering what they're doing, and they were curious too. As soon as that cap fell off, there was like those machines in Las Vegas where you hit the jackpot and all these coins come out. Well, what fell out of there was like thousands of psychiatric pills. And most of them were antipsychotic drugs. And I'm looking at these things, and they spread all over the floor. They were just bouncing all over the room. There were thousands of them. They must have been throwing pills down in that banister for decades. And I'm looking at these things and going, each one of those is a vote from a psychotic patient to go nuts. Why are they doing this? Why are they throwing these medicines away? It's the only thing that's keeping them sane. Back then, I didn't know much about the voices then. That was like a bit by bit learning process. What I did know by the time I left the state hospital, that the voices they heard, whatever they were consistently negative. You know, they weren't random. They were always negative. You know, if they were a hallucination, I mean, hallucinations are positive, negative, mediocre. They're all over the place. You know, there's. My question was when I left there is what is it that is holding these things consistently negative? There's something doing that. You know, so it reminded me of that movie where, what they call it, The Enemy Below, where a destroyer was chasing a Nazi U-boat and they beat it up pretty good. And when it would escape, it would go back onto the same course it was on previously, you know, to head back to wherever it was going in Germany. So when the captain lost it, he just went back to that same course again and picked it up again later on. So it's like, you know, what is keeping these hallucinations or whatever on that negative course? What is holding it onto that trajectory? Something was. It was never good. The voices were never good stuff. They were never mediocre stuff. They were virtually always negative stuff. You know, and they didn't like talking about them. And I found out later that the voices themselves were telling them not to say anything. The voices were telling you talk about it. They're gonna medicate you. They're gonna fill you full of meds, and in effect they did. You know, and then out in the community, the voices were saying, "Don't talk about them, or they're gonna fill you full of meds, and they'll lock you up too." So they didn't want the patient talking about whatever they were. And I'm like, well, that's pretty weird for a hallucination. What kind of hallucination would do that? So after getting out of the PhD program, which provided nothing useful, I mean, there was nothing clinically useful there. I went to work in an emergency room at one of the hospitals in Tucson, and eventually landed a job at the state prison psychology department, you know, here in Tucson, and found that here I was back with schizophrenics again. You know, I didn't want to deal with them. I mean, I was sick of trying to figure them out, what was going on with them, and I was beating my head against the wall. I didn't know what was happening. And it was like some big hand grabbed me and said, "Okay, back to the schizophrenics again." You know, so here I was with a prison full of schizophrenics. But it was a lot easier actually in the prison, because I didn't have to worry about one of them going to the warden and saying, "Oh, the psychologist is asking me about my voices," and then getting put on the carpet and threatened for doing that.
Right.
I mean, if any prisoner who went to a warden and said, "Hey, the psychologist is asking me about my voices, man, I don't like it," that warden would go, "Get out of my face, buddy. Get away." You didn't want to hear anything about it. Yeah?
So you were free to ask.
I was free. I was free to ask. I was free to experiment. I was, you know. So what I did, I mean, there were plenty of schizophrenics there too, because now that they had thrown them all out of the state hospital, the only way they could support themselves out there was, you know, steal stuff or rob people. And so they ended up using drugs and getting in prison. And so here was the prison with the same population that I had at the state hospital, you know, 2,000 miles away. And what was so interesting is that the voices were the same. They ran the same patterns. They said the same things. They behaved in the same manner. As the voices that infested the patients in the state hospital, you know, 2,000 miles away. You know, it was like they were all made from the same cookie cutter. And I'm like, what's with that? You know, why are they saying the same things? I mean, here I'm thousands of miles away, and it's the same thing. It's like they all graduated from the same school somewhere. I'm like, that's odd. That's really odd. So here I was again, like like, what is going on with these friggin' people? Why are they doing this? Why are they going off their meds? Why are they acting so bizarre? Why are they stabbing people? Why are they killing themselves? Why are they acting like a bunch of lunatics? I mean, what is going on with them? And, and by then I suspected this, chemical brain imbalance stuff was a crock of crap. If they didn't have any way to measure it, then it was just a bunch of bull. And the same stuff was going on in the prisons. The psychiatrists there. Oh, it's a chemical brain imbalance. The only thing we can do is these meds again. So here we was back in the same boat again.
Right.
But this time, what I could do is I could pick a handful or so of psychotic prisoners who I made a deal with. I said, hey, I'll work with you to the best of my knowledge, and I'll help you out the best I can. But what I want from you is real-time reports of when you're hearing the voices and what they're saying and what they're doing in response to what I tell you to do. So I found this strange rule of thumb was that anything that pissed off the voices, I figured was harming them, whatever they were. They didn't like it. So if they didn't like it, that's good. And they were in a prison. So if they acted out, they were perfectly capable of dealing with whatever they did. So all I had to do is watch it. They didn't act out on me. But the guys I was working with, they were pretty good. And then these stories started coming out. I found that the voices were running fixed patterns. And I'm like, not just the negative patterns, but there were more patterns. And I started collecting these patterns and going, well, if they're running patterns, then they can't be hallucinations.
What kind of patterns?
Oh, I think I have a list of them here somewhere. Now, this was collected over years. Okay, here's the patterns. They were consistently negative. They were anti-religious, consistently. They didn't like the person reading the Bible. If they tried to read the Bible, they would start screaming and hollering. They got louder. They tried to drive them away from them. They would constantly create and foster negative emotion. They would try to upset the patient. Then they would energetically drain their victim. So after the voices attacked, their energy levels went down to nothing. Strangely enough, they got louder after sunset. They got louder if ignored. They fostered self-destructive behavior. They fostered isolation. They demanded the attention of their victims. They maneuvered for increased control over their victims. They gaslighted them. They manipulated perception. They had complete access to the patient's memory. They would demand that the patient not tell anybody about their presence. It was interesting when they were shocked with a rubber band, a snap of a rubber band, they would shut up temporarily. Nothing else I knew that could shut them up. They were consummate liars. They lied about everything. They couldn't be trusted to make any kind of deal. They would consistently steer their victim away from anything that would generate any kind of happiness or joy. They manipulated feeling without speaking. They short-circuited reason. They would try to pass themselves off as the patient's thoughts. They could evoke selective forgetting. They filled the victim's mind with negative thoughts about themselves and others. They were destructive of any positive self-concept. They pulled their victim away from consensual reality. They used confusion as a means of instilling negative suggestions, and they were aversive to anything positive or beautiful. Any attempt to inform the schizophrenic patient that they were energetic parasites would trigger a volatile reaction.
Interesting.
Let me get back here. Okay, I'm back. Let me see. There was a couple of things there that I wanted to talk about, but I forgot what they were. So, that, as I was working with these guys, I found that when they were upset with something, the voices, I assumed that, like anything else, I mean, when it gets upset, it doesn't like what's going on. So one of the things that I learned in the state hospital was they didn't like the 23rd Psalm. And for the most part, the patients felt helpless to do anything against these voices. They didn't know what they were for the most part. They didn't know what to do about them. They didn't know how to fight back against them. And they felt completely helpless, which just added fuel to the flame. So I was working with a psychologist who worked at a private hospital in California, Dr. Wilson Van Dusen. He was a clinical psychologist. He was a student of Emanuel Swedenborg, who was a Christian mystic some 300 years ago. And Swedenborg would take voyages to heaven and hell. And he would come back and he'd write about them. And Van Dusen noticed that the voices in his schizophrenic patients matched exactly what Swedenborg was saying about the evil spirits that he was talking to on the other side. And he started writing about that. And I found that very interesting. So I started emailing him, and he sent me a book written back in the 1920s by a dentist whose wife was a psychic. And he would use static electricity to shock schizophrenics with the static electricity. And the voices hated that. And he said that they would leave the patient's body, and then his wife, who was a psychic, would pick up on them and talk them into the light. And if they went into the light, they disappeared.
The voices.
So I found that very interesting. So here's Wilson sending me all these advertisements for static shock machines. And I wrote him back and I said, "Are you crazy? If they find out that I'm shocking inmates, they're going to lock me up. What are you thinking?" So I'm like, I got to test this out. And I went for months and months and months. Like, how can I do this without getting fired? How could I administer some kind of shock to these guys to see what effect it had on the voices without being drug up before the medical director? And I've had enough of that at the state hospital. So one day, and this was like, it went on for months. I'm like, how do I do this? How do I do this? Off and on. All these ideas that wouldn't work. And I was talking to a secretary one day in the prison, and I looked down on her desk, and here was a rubber band. And I looked at that, and I went, So I snatched up that rubber band. I pulled in one of the psychotic prisoners I was working with, and I said, "I'm going to give you this. When your voices start up, snap it real hard and tell me what happens." So consistently, he reports that the voices shut up temporarily. They actually shut up. They would shut up for 20 seconds to half a minute. Which was great, because that was a period of time where I could get information into them. I could get information to them about what I knew about the voices, because while the voices were prattling, they couldn't concentrate. I mean, it was like, when you're trying to talk in a loud bar, you hear all this, and you can't get through. That's what it was like with them. So the two things I knew at the time was the 23rd Psalm. So what I'd do is I'd give them the rubber band, and I said, snap the rubber band, repeat the 23rd Psalm. That's like punching them in the face. So I had all these inmates running around snapping the rubber band and repeating the 23rd Psalm. I was actually handing it out to them until the chief psychologist caught me and said, "What are you doing?" And I said, "This works. Yeah, this works. The voices don't like it. They shut up when you snap the rubber band. They don't like it." They ordered me to stop. So I'm like, okay, there we go. Here it comes again. So what I get is piece by piece, I get these stories from these guys about their interactions with the voices. When the voices came in the office, we were figuring out ways to disrupt them. So I was trying to figure out ways to disrupt those patterns, that you had there, and wondering what would happen if those patterns was disrupted, because the ones that we were able to disrupt, they didn't like it. They didn't like it. So, I'm getting all this information from these guys, and figuring out ways to disrupt these voices and giving them homework. So I'm like, okay, do these things and come back next week and tell me how it worked.
So you're ultimately trying to help them out, I'm guessing, from the voices. Like that was kind of your job in the institute.
How do we get rid of the voices?
Gotcha.
How do you disrupt them? I mean, what effect can I have on them? Because regular counseling was like spitting in the wind. You're wasting your time.
Right.
So it's like when I saw that they didn't like disruptions to their patterns, I'm like, okay, well, let's do some disrupting and see what happens. And this went on and on and on until I got a good sized list of things that they could do to disrupt. And then all of a sudden they started coming back and saying the voices don't like what you're doing. They're getting pissed off with you. And I'm like, well, yeah, tough shit. Tough crap. So we kept going, and it, here these disruptions are having an effect on the voices. They didn't like it. So here's one patient I'm working with that as he's leaving, he turns around and he looks at me and he says, "You know what you're doing is dangerous, don't you?" And I went, "No." I just looked at him. I didn't think it was. I mean, they're stuck in your head, not mine. And then he turns around and leaves. And I'm like, well, what was that? I don't know. So I kind of blew it off. This guy's getting better and better. He's
the one who told you it was dangerous.
Yeah, the one who, he's
Right.
he's gaining more and more control.
Okay.
And then he comes to my office one day without a pass, and just knocks on my office. I had to deal with these guys that if they were feeling like they were losing it, that they could throw pebbles at my window, and I'd get them in as soon as I could. So we had a working relationship together. So he comes in unannounced, knocks on my door, and he says, "The voices want to talk to you." I'm like, "They want to talk to me personally?" He goes, "Yeah, they want to talk to you personally." That hadn't happened in 25 years. I mean, it never happened. I'd never talked to them personally. It was always through the patient. They would say, "Oh, they're calling you a piece of crap, and they're saying you're stupid and crazy and don't listen to anything you say." It was common stuff. And but it was never personally. It was never straight up. And the more I'm going into this, the more unstable my denial system is getting. That these things are some figment of their subconscious mind or something. I mean, by the time this started happening, my denial system was very shaky. But I kept patching it together because I just couldn't conceive of them being anything else than, something gone wrong in their subconscious mind or something like that. I mean, there's had to be some logical explanation for this, but I couldn't find one, and neither could anybody else. So he comes in, he sits down, and I said, close the door, and I said, well, what do they got to say? And he said, these words came out of his mouth.
Can't make me lie to my heart. No one tells me where I should start. Freedom first is what I say. Nothing now gonna get